Well, g'day. I have just made Gundagai, so I left about 9:30 this morning. It's now nearly 4:30. I had to do a couple of stops because I was so tired. I've never done that before. Anyway, I'm here at Gundagai where I'll stay the night. It's warm but not as hot as the other day. And welcome back to my channel. This is part 5 of this week's adventure, and as I stated in the last episode, look at that beautiful view. The video you're about to watch is Dougal James giving us an explanation of the history of all of these bikes and more. I honestly struggled to keep up a bit, so I'm going to be very interested to re-watch it as well and absorb that information. So enjoy this video. It's going to be a longish one, I think. There'll be very little editing because I didn't want to take out anything that he said. Bye everybody, and thanks for joining me. And I'm not sure because we're only a couple of weeks away from Christmas and I've got the kids and mum and dad, so I don't think there's going to be any adventures this side of Christmas, but after Christmas there will be. So Merry Christmas, and please all be safe and keep well, and we'll see you in the new year, if not before. Maybe some shorts and some stuff. Bye. So this is the Black Swan Hotel, and the person who owns this is an avid motorcycle collector, in particular Indian, of which I'm finally here with the famous Dougal. The story I heard was that you collect all these beautiful motorbikes and to display them somewhere. You bought this pub.
Yeah, I think of it as a Cheers sort of concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I've got some of the bikes here, and I've got some of the bikes in other places, and and I've got another building down the road that we're hoping to set up likewise to have a few more bikes in.
Oh, great!
So, you've seen the choppers?
Yes, I've seen the choppers on the stage there.
The thing to recognise here is that there aren't very many genuine Indian choppers because, of course, with Indian stopping in '53. By the time the 60s came, there weren't a lot of Indians on the road. In the 60s, when they were doing the choppers, the bikes got made as these look, and there's one Harley there, but the other three were all Indians. And so the bikes were made into choppers, they were ridden as choppers, and when they broke down in those days, it was a bit hard to find parts. And so they got basically trashed or left in sheds. And then when they got discovered over the last 30, 40 years, because Indians now are worth so much, everybody restored them back to being sort of nice and bright and conventional Indians.
Never seen an Indian made into a chopper before.
Yeah, so it's very hard to actually find them. Yeah. This one's very interesting. The one there,
the red one at the front there. Yeah.
That's actually a Scout chopper, although it's stroked, and so it's more like a 59-inch. And Sammy Pierce was a guy who, in the 60s, he assembled the Steve McQueen collection, and he had dealerships on the West Coast. And in the 60s, he started assembling Indians out of the leftover parts, because he had a lot of parts from regular road scouts, but also from chiefs, and then a lot of army parts. And so he made about 50 of these bikes using various different parts. And so this was actually a chopper made by him in his workshop, as was. So, yeah.
How do you find them? Are you?
You finger on the pulse. But
without sounding predictable, you scout for them, do you?
Yeah. So
sorry.
This one came from Boston.
Oh, okay.
And,
Boston. Scout chopper.
Yes. Yeah. And so I had it for a while, and then I was visiting Glenn Pierce, who's now in his mid-80s, and he's Sammy Pierce's son, mentioning that because they had the company called AMCA, which you can see on the engine number. And so I was mentioning to Glenn that I had this bike and somebody had chopperized it, and he said, just a minute. And he said, what was the number? And I was in America with him, and so I rang back. He said, no, that's how we made it. And so they used to actually make choppers in his shop as a chopper, or they would make them as a bobber, or they would make them as a conventional Scout or as a Chout, whatever you chose.
Right.
And sometimes
a Chout.
A
Chout,
like
that's a sort of hybrid with the...
a big engine in a Chout.
A big engine in a Scout, and you call it a Chout. So it's a combination of a Chief and Scout, a hybrid.
Yeah, so Yes, so some of the most famous racing bikes, Indian racing bikes, were Chouts, and I've got a few scattered around, and so they were either stroker Scouts, which is what this one is, like the 57-inch, and that was where you used often Harley flywheels to make them up to either 51 or 57-inch. You either used Chief flywheels or used Harley flywheels. And so that's what that would look like. But then Shout is when you use a Chief 1200 or 1340cc engine in a Scout. So that's even bigger again.
Yes.
So in the 50s, the Indians, the brand name was, the Indians stopped in 53, so the brand name was continued, and they used to bring over other English bikes and rebadge them as Indians. So again, Sammy Pierce, who was still an Indian dealer at that time, he was importing the English bikes, and so some of these hybrid bikes he made had forks from the English bikes on them, and some of them had seats and guards and things, so they were really a combination of Indian and English bikes, of which there were several brands that they were bringing over at the time. So that's a military Chief that's been civilianised. So the military Chiefs were 1200cc, and they were in military garb, and they were made by Indian in the war years from about 1940 through to about 44. But Indian, as opposed to Harley, stopped supplying the domestic market with any bikes, and they turned their whole production through to military production. And so Chiefs were not available in America. They went to Canada, to Europe, England, and Australia and New Zealand. And so they were all in military garb. And so in the 70s and 80s, when some people started to get interested in Indians in Australia, the only ones you could get were the early 20s Scouts, because a lot of those came to Australia and New Zealand. And then the war years era, which was the 741s, the 600 or 500cc, 600cc ones, and then these 1200cc ones. And so early on, quite often people who like the aura of the Indian would do this and civilianise them. So we've got the big guards there, and this one's a stroker, so it's gone from 1200 to 1340cc. So it's a standard bike that I would ride around one. So this is about 29-30 era, and so it's got a front brake, which means it's a lot more usable for us. But again, it's got a stroker engine, so it's 57-inch, still got the same 3-speed gearbox, and so this is a very light bike. Got a rigid rear end. It's got the suspension on the front, but no dampening system. So this sort of bike will do 100 mile an hour, but it doesn't stop very well. This one up the top here is a Scout. Basically, they went broke in the Second World War because they weren't supplying the domestic market, and so then they went to making these vertical twins, because they were copying the English concept, because that seemed to be the way forward. And so they started off with a 240cc single or 220cc single, and then a 440 twin, and it was a little underpowered, and also the frame and things were not particularly good, and the electrical system was terrible, so they weren't very successful. And when they first brought them out, it was they brought out, I think, 18 of them to race at a particular race called Laconia, and so I think all 18 broke down, and it was a disaster for them, and then it ruined the company for the next couple of years. They beefed up the frames and they beefed up the engines to make this bike, which is a Warrior, and so that's the 500cc version. And this was actually a good bike, and so it had a good frame, the engine was better, more powerful, and this would have actually been the bike that could have taken them into the rest of the second half of the 20th
Polaris
century.
need to think about reintroducing the 500cc Warrior.
Yes, they
Makes
should.
Sense.
As
Do
a
you
vertical
think?
twin, they should.
You've got the tip first from us.
So, yes, it was a much lighter bike, much more usable, serviceable.
That's what I can see myself on that size eventually. These big things are getting
when
too
we
big
go
for me.
upstairs, we'll see a mid-20s Scout, and so this is was used as like a hot rod sporting machine, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But if you look at the sprocket on the back, so that's a hill climber bike, which means it was designed for competition one bike at a time going up a very steep hill,
Yeah.
and the guy that got the furthest up the hill won the event.
Yes, yes.
Or the small percentage of people that actually made it over the hill would get judged in terms of time.
Yep.
So if you come to the corner,
Okay. I hope you're all paying attention because I'm going to have questions at the end of this video. Oh my goodness, yes.
this is what
That's the hill climb.
Yeah, so that's what hill climbing is about.
Yeah.
And so initially in the teens and very early 20s, the main form of racing was their board track racing, and so that was bikes that had large wheels, large engines, 1000cc, often no gears, no brakes, and no clutch. And so they used to be doing 100 mile an hour around velodromes.
Yes.
And there were a lot of serious accidents, and in the early 20s they ended up banning that sort of riding.
Oh, okay,
because
so this doesn't exist anymore?
So too many spectators and too many motorcycles were getting killed, so they banned it. And then this was typical local fair type racing, so dirt track racing came into vogue, and that was actually, most of it was started in Australia and New Zealand, and we sent riders to Europe and they took on that style of racing, and likewise to America, which was sliding racing, on dirt tracks, because we had some velodromes, but Australia wasn't as developed as America, and so we had a lot of dirt tracks, like racing tracks, horse racing tracks, and so the motorcyclists would ride around those, and they learnt the sliding technique, and so they were very good at that, and they used to go over doing demonstration runs all over the place. So here,
that's fantastic. What a picture!
An alternate form of local racing. So as you see the vehicles down the bottom there, you would all go. So you'd all go out of town, and you would have a big hill, and you'd have marks of about every 10 metres up the hill, and the spectators or the informed spectators would line either side of the track with grapple hooks and chains and ropes, and so the guy would go up the centre of the track one by one, and the chains on the wheel you can see there is because you're trying to get grip.
The chains are there. Yep, see those.
And the bikes were very, very low gear. They were often only had, say, 1 second gear, and that was all they'd run in. So they would start at the bottom of the hill, wheel spin the bike, and then take off. Yeah. And then as they went up the hill, if they did hit stumps or rocks, the bike would often keel over like this and wheel stand. And so in time they ended up lengthening the rear trail, like the rear swing. Well, it's not a swing arm, it's rigid rear end. So the interesting thing here is this is Floyd MD.
Sorry, who's this?
Floyd MD.
Floyd MD.
If you look up here,
there he is there.
Also Floyd MD.
Yeah.
And those two photographs were taken about 4 days apart.
Yeah.
And so this is immediately after he won Daytona. So that was the biggest race in the world. It was his first attempt at hill climbing. Yeah. And he took the risk of doing that 4 days before that. Oh. And that's the biggest race in the world at the time.
So he did this before that.
Yeah, so there's sort of risks that they would take. And so
I was going to ask you what happened to that, because did he topple or did he manage to...
Yeah, I honestly don't know, but again, his
that looks like it's way over the gravity he's going to go.
So his son's alive and well, and in America too, in LA, and he's about mid-80s as well. Yeah. And so he was the one that provided me with that photograph. Oh, yeah. Again, with Indian, when they recognised that they lost the race with Harley in the Second World War, Indian had stopped making their race bikes, their Scouts, in about 1941, and then Harley continued to make their WRs, which were their racing bikes, and Harleys were always making 100, 150 a year. Indian were making nothing for 6-7 years, and so Indians were not winning any races, and also all the young GIs were coming back from America, where they'd been riding the WLAs at 750cc, and the Indians provided were only 500 or 600, and so Indians were considered by most of the young guys as being piss poor because they didn't perform as well. So Indian decided they'd do something about that, and they made 50 bikes which were 45 inch or 750. 50 of them, and there are only 49 states in America then, so that's basically one bike per state.
Per state,
And they gave them to their dealers who provided them to their best riders, and they sold them at about $1 each, but you'd only get them if you were a fantastic rider. and then they started competing in 1948 against the Harleys, and so that was the real...
What a clever strategy.
Yeah, Cowboys and Indians thing.
Yes, yes.
And there were 3 or in fact 4 guys that between them won about 50% of the national races over that 3 or 4 year period.
Come around here.
4 guys.
4 guys, and they just cleaned up.
3 of them were called, got denoted as the wrecking crew because of the impact they had.
Oh, wrecking crew. Wow.
And this is where it all comes from. So this is the wrecking crew, the 3 guys here.
Oh, that's them there. So I've got.
Yeah. So
I've worn the right. I've worn the right shirt.
Beckman.
Yep. Beckman.
Tuman and Bobby Hill.
Bobby Hill in the middle there.
Yeah. So Tuman. So these guys knew not him. He died about 12, 14 years ago.
Yeah.
Bill Tuman died about 3 years ago with COVID, or in COVID.
Oh, yeah.
And he was 99.
Wow.
Bobby died 2 years ago, and he was just over 100.
Gee.
And the only one left is Jerry Callan here.
Jerry. Down here?
Yeah, and he's well into his 90s now.
Wow.
But everybody else died off. But you'll see the same guys
all
in
there.
most of the racing pictures. This guy
yes.
here, Floyd MD again. Or
Floyd, oh yes.
Yeah. So that's Nancy, that's Bobby's wife.
That's
Bobby Hill.
Bobby Hill and Nancy.
Nancy. Yeah.
Lovely.
These guys were riding in the post-war period up until the mid-50s.
Right.
So that's what I got really interested in, was those post-war bikes.
Yes.
I've got several of those, and these guys I got to know a long time ago, and so I've been visiting them for the last 25, 30 years.
Oh, wonderful.
Apart from the fact they've all now died, apart from the one guy there who I still see and talk to.
Yeah.
So we've been able to get a lot of these bikes.
Okay, now
we're going upstairs.
Yeah.
So when the new Polaris Indian group started, so there's been many reawakenings of the Indian brand. So Polaris has by far been the most successful, really.
Yep.
But when they started, they did a really nice job with the Chiefs looking period but performing well. And then they decided to go on the FTR route. And they did the promotions of the FTR according to the wrecking crew, because that's how they were trying to build it up.
Yeah, okay.
And so at that stage, Bill and Bobby were still alive and tracking around, so I had their bikes, so we sent their bikes back to America, and they did a tour of quite a few states with their actual bikes, with the FTR. Hugely successful FTR, but we didn't all know that at the time, we just knew that they'd made this bike.
Yeah.
And the Ducati Scrambler had been put on the market just a little bit before that, very successful. And so they were saying they only had one of these bikes, the FTR. We thought maybe they had a few more.
Yes.
But we said, gosh, this is a fantastic bike, it looks so great, you need to release these to the commercial market. And I was saying, I don't think we'll do that. And we said it needed to be a road registerable thing because it was such a high performance thing. Yes, maybe. And all the time that's what they were doing. And so within about another year, then they brought out the FTR.
The FTR. I want Indian to do the Warrior 500cc for my retirement.
Look in this
Okay, I can see some Indians amongst there.
So head forward a little bit.
Yep.
My interest is in oddball things.
Yes.
And so likewise my Indians.
Yep.
So
you've got some at the back there.
Again,
you've got quite a few here actually.
Yeah, so...
This isn't an Indian, is it? Anyway, you go, start.
Right. So
I'm getting ahead of myself.
This is a guy, Roy Burke. He was a hill climber along the west coast, right up to Oregon. And he was the best hill climber up that coast. There are other hill climbers on the other coast, Brownie Beatar and others. And so that's another one of my interests, is collecting hill climbers. But all these old guys, when they got old and gradually started to move off their bigger bikes, they started customising Scouts as being their everyday bikes. So this was Erwin Smith, or Smitty.
Oh, right,
who's
Smitty, that's
very famous.
one there.
So this was his daily rider.
Okay,
and you'll notice if you look on it, there's a disc brake on the front.
Oh, okay, right.
Yep. So they used to modernise these bikes. So as an 80-year-old, 80, they could still ride around on a bike that was light enough. And this was Roy Burke's, and this is an interesting bike too. So the interesting thing there, if you look, is the rear. You can see that he's put on his own sprung rear end.
Oh yes, I can see the spring there. Yep.
And so there's other ones I've got of that group. Over there, just behind the green bike, is the same as Bobby Hill raced at Daytona on.
Right.
And so
that's a BSA.
Yes. So Bobby and Bill and the other guys all used to race English bikes at Daytona, whereas they dirt tracked with the Indians, because the Indians 3 gears side valve motor could only get a certain number of revs, so their top speed was about 100, 105 mile an hour.
Right.
And so Daytona, you need to be able to go, or in those days, 120, 125. So they all moved to English bikes just for that reason.
Okay.
And they were factory riders. So things like this, Bobby Hill got that bike delivered to him. There were 3 BSAs. He had a choice of a single, a double, a sprung rear end, or a non-sprung. And he had an opportunity to ride it up and down the road, about 400 yards, and that was it. And then he was in the race.
Oh, wow. Gee,
and so
that was his practice, 400 yards.
Yep, and he won the race.
Gifted.
Once that was finished, they took the bikes back. Same thing with Bill Schumann and the other great riders. So very different to factory riding.
Now, I've got to understand this one.
So come back a bit.
Because that doesn't look anything like an Indian.
Okay, so this is an Eldorado Moto Guzzi.
Oh, okay.
You have to see from the side. Come around the corner here.
Yep, just around here.
Yeah. So Indian in the war years, when they decided to make things for the army, the army put out a tender for a 2-cylinder or more motor vehicle that had a shaft drive, could stand idling all day without moving, without blowing up, and could take 2 or more people. Okay. And so Indian made a transverse V twin. Harley made a horizontally opposed. So Harley basically copied the BMW. And Indian made their own completely new everything, which was a V twin like this.
Okay.
And they both had to make 1,000 of them, which they did. The army didn't take either. And they took another vehicle made by Willys called a general purpose vehicle, which had 4 wheels, and it had a little tray like a utility at the back, so it could actually carry a stretcher or an engine. And that won the tender. And so that was called the Willys GP, general purpose, or Willys Jeep.
Willys
and that's
Jeep,
where all the Jeeps came from. And so after that, they put out that tender to General Motors and all the other manufacturers who all started making Jeeps. But the Willys Jeep was the original. And then there was the Land Rover came after the war.
And so there was 1,000 of these left?
Well, yeah, not this though, because this is a Moto Guzzi. So in another building, I've got a couple of those Indians transverse V-twins, which is side valve.
Right.
And they had the same cylinder and cylinder heads as the Scout V-twin. But there's been some people over the years trying to modernise Indians with some sort of retro look. And so this is a probably late 60s, early 70s Moto Guzzi. And you can see it's got the Indian guards. And it's made, and again, this is the sort of thing, if Indian had been able to move forward after the war and had used their transverse V-twin design, they would have been so much more successful. So they didn't do it and they collapsed. Over there.
Which one?
These are your bikes, the red and
yes, the reds over there.
So they're the little Indian twins. Wheel your way over there, you'll find it's a perfect size for someone like yourself. That would be something for Polaris to look into.
I agree.
It is genuine Indian. All these 3
all of these.
They're all vertical twin Indians.
They're fabulous.
But you can see they started off a little bit smaller. And as I say, like the one downstairs, then moved up to 500cc.
I like that idea. I like the name Warrior as well. This is like got the bare bones.
Very significant bike. So Franklin was the engineer that was making the side valve engines. So he came from England, and he was their main engineer for the Scout, designed the Scout, and the Scout that went through the 20s from 1920 to Bird Runner and so on. This was the absolute pinnacle of the side valve performance. So this is an Altoona side valve, and so this dates back to about 1927, 27, 28. There were 4 of those engines made, and that's one of them. And at the time, they were outperforming the overhead valves. So in the late 20s, in that 26, 27, 28 period, Indian and Harley were both making overhead valve singles and twins as their race bikes and as the hill climb bikes, because they were the highest performance. But they didn't have good enough materials to have them as road bikes because they had a limited life. They would blow up and then they'd rebuild them. But this engine here, these 4 engines, actually had the higher output of anything, but they didn't continue on making. They did continue on with side valves, and in fact that was part of the reason that Indian continued with side valves right up the whole way through. Like even the Chiefs at the last year, 53 were side valves. whereas Harley eventually went to overhead valves.
Yep. And this fellow?
So that one,
Yep.
there's a guy...
Oh, and there's one here too.
George Kelly, who is a guy that was a generation behind the wrecking crew people, but always loved Indians and kept building and racing Indians. And so he actually collected a lot of the old parts from the bikes that had been race bikes and broken down. And he kept racing with his sons right through until recent years. And this is an example of his Scout, and then he went to this Chief. And
oh right, yes, there's another one.
This Chief is another Harley killer. So this was
Harley killer.
Yeah,
say that again.
This
Harley killer.
This was ridden as recent as about 5 or 6 years ago, and was beating all the Harleys. It's a
beast.
Phenomenal. It's a dirt track bike again, and obviously it's very modern.
So what size motor is that then?
I can't
not
honestly
sure.
say.
Yep.
So
looks a bit cafe racerish, doesn't it?
Yeah, allegedly 1200, but there might be
They've done
a little
tricks
bit of stretching going on.
Yeah.
This
Wow.
one here over the back is an as found local fair type racing Scout, so that came from Canada, and I just love that because of its patina.
Yeah. Dougal's just brought me down to his second little area where he stores things. Turned off the alarms. It's a secret destination, this one. So you're working on something here.
Yeah, so that's a 34 Chief.
Yeah. Are you mechanical, Dougal? Are you a tinker?
I'm better with the credit card than I am with the tools. But
I'm much better with a credit card.
Roadside, fix it up type mechanic.
Now this looks the shape looks familiar.
Yeah, so if you have a look in there, when they were doing the film, in New Zealand they made 3 bikes, and this is the one that had the genuine replica frame.
Okay,
And all 3, of course, have the same fiberglass outer.
So that was the frame with the wheels in there, and that's it.
So this was how Bert had it, where this lifted up.
Okay.
And in there, which you may not be able to see, is a 1920 Scout engine.
Right. Okay. I'll get the picture.
There's very few 1920 Scout engines. When they did the film, they actually had Ducati engines in the bikes that were racing in the film because they needed to have something that was reliable and fast, etc.
Right.
And so this was the bike that they had been planning on using, but didn't because they needed the modern day bike.
Okay. And that wouldn't fit in there, is that right? The modern...
They used a modified frame that would take the Ducati engines, I understand, and then they fitted the surrounding fiberglass to it. Okay. And this was the bike that they had intended to use, and now we're completing it with a 1920 engine.
Wow.
Yeah. And
fantastic.
We've got some of the stuff.
Look at the old penny... what do you call those bicycle? Penny farthing, yes.
That's an Indian too. This is a Papoose.
What? A Papoose?
Yeah, so they were made by... an English company,
right?
And they were supplied to the army, and they were paratrooper bikes. So they used to come out of an aeroplane with the people, and supposedly their little Villiers engine that was about 125 cc.
They dropped down.
They could do about 40 or 50 miles, so they could drop them behind enemy lines, and the parachuter would get off, get the bike out, fold the handlebars up, lift the seat up, and they could go that short distance.
For heaven's sakes, a little Papoose.
But they used to also use them as military police vehicles on aircraft
carriers
carriers and around airfields.
That'd look funny.
Yeah.
Coppers on that little thing. We didn't see that. So that's a 4-cylinder 1930.
About 36.
About 36. I love the colours.
Okay. Just by the way, that's a Harley Davidson. So I've only got a few Harleys, and they've all got a special reason they're here.
There's
and that's another one.
Yep.
So that was another one of the racers. When I was talking about their road bikes.
Yes.
So the reason that this was a Harley racer, and he was best friends with my Indian fellas.
Okay.
And so this was his 80 when he was 80. This was his bike he rode around on. And the interesting thing about the Harley is that it had an electric start because it was on a 3-wheel, it was a trike, and so it had electric start because in those days Harleys were all kickstarts. So that's a Harley Davidson that they made 1,000 of in the war years to complete a tender to try and win the tender for the army vehicles. So that's a 750, but it was copied from the BMW. They changed a few vital things so they got away from the infringement, but you'll see it's shaft drive. A lot of the parts were similar to the WLA Harley, but the frame obviously different. Forks I think were very similar. but tail shaft at the back. If you just pan up there.
Okay, let me just come around here.
So this is the Indian that was made with the transverse V twin. So when you were looking at that one that was the Moto Guzzi,
yes,
that was an overhead valve 1967 or 68 Moto Guzzi that someone had made into an Indian. Well, this was the original ones that Indian made 1,000 of. So
right. Oh, this is one of those thousands. Yes, I remember.
Yeah. So you can see, they've got a tail shaft. So these ones I've got here are overhead valve Indians. So in the late 20s, Indian made their racing bikes as overhead valves. They made a very small number of the actual road racer bikes like this.
Yep, sorry.
And they made singles.
Yep.
Singles as well.
And that's a single over there.
Yeah,
these ones.
Both singles.
Wow. I'm slightly confused now, but that's okay. When I go back, I'll.
That's all right. So they're mid-20s and they're single-cylinder bikes that they were again trying to make a light, fast bike for the community. And this thing here is a 2-cylinder and 2-cylinder, so it's got 4 cylinders. So this is the vertical twin, as I was showing you, that they made after the war, and they were not a success. And somebody's made this as a drag bike. It was actually a famous drag bike maker. On the left, another one of my Harleys.
This one?
Yeah. So this is a hill climber Harley.
Yep.
And it's a 1936, which is the first of their knucklehead Harleys. So that's unusual. You've heard perhaps of the Cannonball race?
Yes, I have.
Well, this is a bike that was made in the 20s with 2 V-twin 1000cc engines stuck together. So it's a 4-cylinder V-twin.
Wow.
And this was ridden by Cannonball Baker.
Oh, okay. Gee. How'd you get hold of this one? Just through your...
Oh, well,
just keep,
good luck.
Good luck,
being in the right place at the right time.
Yep. Wow. I mean, they've all got such a good story, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Google this little ripper.
This is an example of the big base races that they had in 1948, and this was a particular guy's bike. It was these colours. This thing here is very interesting. It's one of the vertical twin Indian frames, and it's got the V-twin Scout bottom end of the engine, and their BMW Isetta cylinders on the top. So this was made by the guys that used to work with Crocker in the late 50s, and this was probably made in the 60s or late 60s, about the same time Sammy Pierce was making those other hybrids out of India.
Okay.
So there were a lot of people trying to figure out some way of having a overhead valve.
Is this an Indian?
Fast Indian. Yeah. So this is again a overhead valve Indian. So this is a road racing bike from the late 20s.
This is the true Indian red, isn't it? Do you think? Or I mean,
so Indian.
I love that colour.
Later, Indian were owned by DuPont, the paint manufacturers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So in the 30s, you could have, I think you had to pay about $2 or $5, and you could have any colour you wanted. So initially, the Indians were mostly red, and some of them were black, and then in the 30s they started having all the Art Deco colours and all the wonderful paint jobs that you see on those 30s era Indians.
DuPont, well there you go.
Yep.
So Dougal also makes spare parts, specifically stuff that can cater for the old Indians and everything that you collect, So that's all. Yeah. I'll just give you an idea of I have no clue what any of that is. Yeah. But Dougal knows.
People knowing old Indians will recognise what all this represents.
That's all. It all means something to you technical people. Chung over my head. There's a couple of Indians in this other section, which we've got this one.
Yeah. So that was a bike we made up. That's a genuine big base bike, but it's done up in the colours of Beckman, who was the third person of that wrecking crew.
And there's a couple of fancy ones up there.
The yellow one up there.
Is that a guild?
That's another one of those transverse V-twins.
Yep, it's fancy. We've all seen the world's fastest Indian, which is this picture here, and which one here. That's with the actual. Anyway, we've seen. Everyone has seen the movie, fabulous movie with Anthony Hopkins starring as Burt Munro, and this gentleman here.
So this is Rolly Free, and so this is a Vincent in about 1949. So he did the world speed record at 150 or 151 mile an hour, like that, in the bathing trunk. Exactly like that. So the connection between him and Bert's, this is 1949.
Right.
Bert's stuff was in the 60s and very early 70s. So that's 15, 18 years later. So in the film, you see a couple of people mentoring Bert, even though they're the same age, and pushing him off to start.
Yes, yeah.
And Rolly Free was one of those
guys.
Who had the hat on, I think.
And look at him doing that.
He had been doing these speed records for all those years before. So he'd been going to Bonneville for all those years. And so when Bert turned up in the early 60s, everybody thought he was a very quaint customer.
Yes.
The other connection is Sam Pearce, who I showed you and spoke about some of the, and Glenn Pearce.
Yep.
So Sam Pearce was the sponsor of Bert Munro.
Right.
And so Bert used to come across and leave his bike frame and the whole rolling chassis with Sam Pearce, and Bert would come across just with the engine instead of bringing the whole bike.
Yes.
And the guy I was saying, Glenn, who's the son, now 85, he was actually, it was, when you see the film, they did a bit of artistic license with the film.
Yes, I believe.
But where you see the house and Bert being chewed out by the woman because Bert was boiling up his piston material in her best fry pan and saucepans, that was Glenn Pearce's house.
And, where they filmed
the
it.
young boy, teenager, was Glenn at that time, and he, as I say, is now 85.
And he was
but all that was happening at Glenn Pearce's house, and then Bert would get these old cars and drive from there out to Bonneville.
Bert was a bit of a ladies' man.
He was a character.
He was a character.
By all accounts, yes.
I've heard. Good on him. Yeah, I thought Anthony Hopkins did a great job on that. That's fabulous.
Yep.
Thanks, Dougal. Wow. Well, thanks again, Dougal. This will be 2 videos today, I'm sure. So this bike, the hill climb bike, is what I just sat on, which it comes right up the top, and that's the big wheel with the.
Standing on this and
those and they do a mono, as they say. Fabulous.